I hope you enjoyed that episode of Bob Dylan because we really kept you waiting for the next one. I'm sorry for the delay. I just got married and it was a wonderful day, marching through the streets of Dublin behind a piper to the sound, actually, of the dawning of the day. Like everyone else who went along to the wedding, I seemed to get sick after it. And, your voice is everything in this line of work. But I'm back. I'm back behind the microphone again. The dawning of the day is a fitting title for this podcast because we're talking about 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm currently writing a history, I finished it, of Dublin's public houses. And when people hear you're doing that, you're almost always met by the very same immediate reaction. Will so-and-so or such and such a place be in it? And people mention a handful of city centre pubs that are really considered part and parcel of the city. The Cobblestone, remember, word of its perilous situation in 2021 was enough to lead to street protests. People also sometimes raise characters. Occasionally they'll ask about a barman. More often they're asking about a barfly, and that Dublin pubs are important to understanding the broader story of the capital. It's pretty undeniable, isn't it? The Dictionary of Irish Biography from the Royal Irish Academy, how I love that project. There's lives in there as diverse as former Taoiseach and Arctic explorers, but you'll also find Paddy O'Brien in there, head barman of McDade's in its literary heyday. And for a barman, not a publican, but a barman, to find his place in something like the Dictionary of Irish Biography, that says an awful lot about how important these institutions are. There's a lot of stardom around the public house. One drinking buddy of Behan recalled how drinking with him called for the thirst of a camel, the stamina of an ox, the stomach of an ostrich, and a neck like, well, you can finish that one, I'm sure. And the broader social and cultural history of the pubs themselves is my main concern, because we don't need another profile of Kavanagh or Miles Leopoldine or any of these great characters. Trying to focus in on what the pub has meant in the lives of us, the citizenry of Dublin. That was the task I set myself. Pubs exist in other places, of course. When Thomas Burke wrote The English Inn way back in 1930, he began with the declaration that to write of the English Inn is almost to write of England itself. It is as familiar in the national consciousness as the oak and the village green and the church spire. And even more than that, the pub was declared to be an institution unique to England, and there is nothing more English. Look, I think a better point would have been for Burke to argue that there might be a unique kind of English pub, because actually I think there is, and I feel that the same can very much be said about Dublin. Pubs come in a tremendous variety. Some of them don't even call themselves pubs. Some people are deadly serious about what these institutions should be. Back in 1980, one writer talked about the pub as being the preserve of the pint drinker. And when it came to pints, he praised the spit and sawdust citizen who understood it and knew how to treat it. And thankfully, that kind of attitude is fading. Nobody will call the police on a pot of tea enjoyed in a Victorian public house. And we've even lived to see, and they didn't make it, but they existed, the arrival of non-alcoholic public houses in the city, like the Virgin Mary on Capel Street or Board on Clonbrassil Street, which eventually widened its scope. Imagine explaining the concept of a pub with no booze in it to our spit and sawdust citizen back in 1980. When we think about pubs in Dublin, whether we realise it or not, I suppose we're going to map them in our heads. There are different kinds of pubs. So traditional music creates a map in my mind that maybe begins in O'Donoghue's on Merrion Row and passes through places like the Cobblestone in Smithfield. There are other kinds of pubs, literary pubs. We might think about McDade's going back to Paddy O'Brien on Harry Street, or the Flowing Tide, synonymous with the theatre across the road from it. There are other routes too, that won't be known to as many people. In the gay history of Dublin, Brogan's on Dame Street was once the Viking. Bridie's Bar beside the George, part of the George. J.J. Smith's was a very, very important part of that story for women too. But today we're going on a journey around the last of the early houses. That's its own kind of pub. The hardcore would argue that only 3 remain opening at 7 o'clock in the morning. The moderates will give a slightly higher figure, including those that begin to open a little bit later after 9 o'clock. It is one rapidly diminishing type of Dublin pub. Every year it seems an early house is gone. And more than any other category of pub in the city, The mapping of these establishments immediately reveals a geographic logic. They were located primarily around the historic markets area of the city on the north side and near its docker communities on the south side. And these pubs were intended to provide for a city centre workforce who operated on a different time zone entirely from the rest of us. As most were rising for breakfast, these men and women were on their second pints. So this is a journey. For me, it was actually a literal journey, a physical journey around the last of Dublin's early houses. Thanks for your patience, and thank you as ever for tuning in to Three Castles Burning.
Die kleine Kneipe in unserer Straße, da wo das Leben noch lebenswert ist, dort in der Kneipe in unserer Straße.
I have sat in public houses at 7 o'clock in the morning before, with the all-important detail that these establishments were hardly a short stroll from O'Connell Street. It's primarily sitting between Sonnenallee and Karl Marx Strasse in a city that exists on its own terms and outside of the licensing hours of Dublin. I remember being in one Kneipe, that's a name that they bestow on traditional drinking houses in the city of Berlin, and a regular told me that the bar was open 365 days of the year and had not locked its doors in 20 years until the pandemic forced it into a temporary hibernation. And you know what? Nothing I encountered in that pub convinced me otherwise. A pint at 7 o'clock in such an establishment is the end of the night. It's not the beginning. In Dublin, the pubs we're talking about today are something else entirely. Of the remaining early houses in the capital, several are located in the area immediately bordering the historic fruit and vegetable market, opened by Dublin Corporation in 1892, and in the news for all the right reasons this week. Talk of a massive restoration and refurbishment on that market, bringing it back into public use in just a few short years. It's a gorgeous red brick building that will be more at home amidst the Victorian architecture of Belfast.
A place for everything, and everything in its place. In the market, this makes all the difference. In efficient marketing, the place of the market itself, its situation in the city it serves, has become a vital factor.
And while that market building largely ceased functioning in 2019, the area more broadly remains a busy market environment, something we've looked at on the podcast before. There's a beautiful unbroken continuity in the working lives of several families, like dynasties, around those streets, from florists to fruit importers, people that have been there since the very beginning of the market. But one thing that has changed, and quite significantly changed, is the drinking culture around the market. Less and less people work there. The fish market is completely gone. And Capel Street's early houses once catered to these workers, but there were others even closer to the market building. When Kevin Kearns wrote that beautiful oral history, Dublin Pub Life and Lore, Billy Sullivan from the nearby Mary's Abbey told him there was 3 early houses on Arran Street. There was Donohue's and Roberts and Corbett's. This is going back to the 20s. And the Daisy Market dealers, they drink in Corbett's public house at the corner of Little Mary Street next to Many Penny Yard. He'd serve women no problem. They'd wear shawls, they'd have a glass of porter and a baby Powers, and that was 1 and 8pence. Some of them would drink you under the table. Today, Corbett's has traded Charlie's for Swifties. It trades as the popular Hacienda. It no longer opens at 7 o'clock in the morning and now keeps its own rather unique opening hours. Resembling a Spanish white stone cottage externally, the Hacienda Market Bar opens when proprietor Shay feels like it and closes in a similar fashion, ringing a bell to seek admission, which can just as easily be refused. Passing through the entrance brings you into a space where the walls are adorned with pictures of the famous and infamous who have gone before. But today that pub is much more about nighttime than the early morning. In nearby Smithfield, Delaney's and the Cobblestone on North King Street were both early houses, though these catered to a different kind of market worker, with neighbouring Stoneybatter, colloquially known as Cowtown, owing to the importance of the cattle market in former times. These pubs were primarily for men who herded livestock. A young Edna O'Brien working in Cabra as a pharmacy assistant recalled the market environment as something that brought back the reek and constraints of home. At Hanlon's Corner, I'd have to dismount because of all the commotion, the drovers shouting and belting the poor beasts that slithered, their wet scutters everywhere, and bus drivers honking their horns impatiently. The drovers, like myself, all hail from the country and were either bullock men or heifer men. The journalist Jean Kerrigan remembered the same scene, and how cattle were tended by cowboys on bicycles, men with overcoats and hats, furiously pedalling this way and that. Bicycles and sticks, stacked against the wall of a public house at 7 in the morning, is no longer a familiar Smithfield sight. The early house doesn't generally feature in memoir of the city. I mean, pubs do. Pubs are a very important part of so many great Dublin memoirs, but the early house doesn't normally feature. And when it does emerge in someone's memoir or recollections, it tends to mark a moment of tragedy or a dark turn. Bill Kelly's great memoir, My Darling Dublin's Dead and Gone, there's an almost ominous sense of doom as he describes his friendship with Brendan Behan and his love for the bars around the markets. These had an added advantage. They opened at 7 in the morning, Bill wrote. In the following months, he introduced them to me. He was soon dead. More often than finding them in the memoirs of the city, you tend to find them in the newspapers as a kind of human interest story that popped up on occasion. The legendary newspaper columnist Con Houlihan, I refuse to call Con Houlihan a sports writer. He was so much more than a sports writer. In 2008, was still frequenting these establishments, describing them for readers of his column. In Dublin's sub-language, they are known as the early houses. This, in loose translation, means pubs that open their doors at 7 in the morning. Those fortunate people who are privy to all knowledge tell us that they are instituted to make life easier for milkmen and market gardeners. That was in the days of horsepower and pony power. The good people who bring us the milk and the vegetables no longer need the early houses, and yet they are as much a part of our culture as ever. Now, Con wrote that in 2008, and since 2008, more than half of the remaining early house establishments in Dublin have closed their doors or have reinvented themselves as something else. In the same year that Con wrote that, the Sunday Independent reported that the future is plain for early house drinkers as the government plans a ban. Looking especially forlorn of the old early houses along Dublin's quayside is the Chancery. Its painted sign remains. The cock of the morning, the early morning rooster with a Dublin backdrop behind him. The name was derived, of course, from its proximity to the forecourts, and like the legal eagle, the presence of the court system influenced a number of pub names around Dublin. But while the latter pivoted towards good quality food and reinvention as a restaurant, the Chancery has sat empty now for a number of years. The brilliant website Brand New Retro, which scans up old magazines and newspaper articles of interest, posted a real gem from SLATE Magazine. You might remember SLATE. It was free, it was frequently libellous, and it's sadly missed. They ran a feature in 2003 on the early houses of the city, including an image of a busy crowd waiting to gain admission to the Chancery on a Saturday morning as a Dublin bus drove by. Readers were told that this place fills up very quickly on a Saturday. If you arrive much later than 8:30, you'll probably have to wait outside until a few people leave. Now, the Dublin of 2003, when SLATE Magazine went down to have a look, had a considerably healthier, so to speak, nightlife scene. And maybe that explains something about the pull of such establishments back then. I mean, SLATE told their readers that there seemed to be a remarkably high tolerance level for MDMA-inspired bladder. And one wonders if the disappearance of city centre nightclubs played some role in the decline of early morning establishments. With what one newspaper described as two friendly but hefty bouncers and a thumping bass line, waiting to get into the Chancery could feel more akin to starting a night than ending it. And in this strange relationship between nightlife and morning drinking, the Chancery wasn't entirely unique. On the other side of the Liffey and towards the Docklands, there is today nothing about the Starbucks at 1 George's Quay that suggests its former life as the White Horse, an early house which was particularly popular with journalists owing to its proximity to the Irish press media empire. Con Houlihan remembered that journalists from other papers were known to drink there too. It was a kind of mart for stories, real or imagined, and for rumours, wild and otherwise. Benedict Kiley writes about it in his memoirs too. Later, when drinking culture changed and Labour in Dublin changed, the White Horse was rechristened the Dark Horse, operating from 7 a.m. until noon at weekends. And a 2006 feature on the pub described how at 11:30 a.m. the DJ spins his last tune and the staff take down the blackout curtains, letting the dreaded sunlight flood in. The weekend had just begun. Similarly, Ned's on Townsend Street, replaced by a hotel, hosted an early morning night called the Early Shift before its closure in recent times. But the White Horse does feel like a pretty significant lost pub of Dublin, up there with the Scotch House and others. Lore about the pub is endless. Green Day, of course, played there in 1991 on a 2017 visit to Dublin to perform to the considerably larger capacity venue of the Point. Billy Joe Armstrong visited the site, tweeting that, it's now a Starbucks. I have a great memory of playing there. No one was allowed to dance in fear of the roof caving in. Everyone was so friendly. Graduating from punk to techno, the pub does really remain a curious footnote in the stories of several music scenes in Dublin. And of course, this being Three Castles Burning, we have to play a little bit of the bootleg tape of the gig. Green Day looking for a pint and eventually getting it.
Hey, can you get us something to drink? I don't know where it is. Excuse me. There he is. Oh, that's my man right there. I know that ain't water.
Pass those down.
But in the heyday of the early houses, there were far more fishmongers and florists than dancers keeping the doors of early houses open. And changing labour explains more in the decline of these pubs than changing recreation. The fruit and vegetable market remained standing, but when it closed as a largely functioning place of business and the exodus of wholesalers into the suburban industrial estates began, there simply wasn't the same level of morning activity in the market's area to keep them going. So gone is the Capel, located on Little Britain Street in the heart of the market's district, replaced by Bar 1661. And that's kind of reflective of the changing nature of the pub and the rise of the cocktail bar. This bar champions the historic Irish spirit of poaching in a legal and regulated way, it should be said, far removed from the unlabelled fizzy drinks bottles full of blinding moonshine from the past. Gone too is MU's on Chancery Street, great pub, lamented in a moving documentary tribute by Brendan Gleeson. Gleeson remembered it as a special place for traditional music sessions. In the morning, it did a good trade of market workers and those from the legal system, nestled as it was right behind the forecourts. And an obituary from Michael Hughes, the much-loved proprietor of the establishment, noted that the bar's early morning opening was often availed of to brace nerves of those facing the stress of legal examination. I think those doing the questioning were sometimes found there as well. What about on the south side of Dublin? Just a short stroll from the Liffey Docklands. Two of Dublin's final early houses trade at the Windjammer and the Porrick Pierce. And that Dublin's Docklands fell into real economic decline before the markets area meant that the number of such public houses in this part of Dublin began dwindling earlier. When the Evening Herald investigated the decline of these pubs in 1986, great title, The Unholy Hour, the proprietor of the Windjammer told them that 10 or 15 years ago there were about 20 early houses in this area. Now there's only about 10. Imagine that. It's not even 10 in all of Dublin now. In a city of very little historical industry, the Docklands were a thriving place of early morning activity, but work was often precarious and irregular. And what Kevin Kearns described so beautifully as a world of masts, funnels, towering cranes, barges, carts, horses, 100 sounds becoming a symphony of Dockland, was also a place where, men got work as they were needed in the loading and unloading of ships. Glass and steel has won the day down there, of course, and the downfall of Dublin's Docklands as a major employer of dockers was the arrival of containerisation, something that marked a dramatic decline in the number of bodies needed by companies working in the importing and exporting of goods.
Now, as you can see, everybody here is working. There's 18 of us here and we're all working.
But I wouldn't say any one of you is breaking your back.
No, thank God.
No.
Well, we broke our backs years ago and broke our hearts.
What do you feel when you see the changes? Because I think you've been at it a long time.
I'm at it since 1917.
How was it then?
It was very hard. And you had to work, and if you didn't work, you weren't employed the next morning.
By 1982, the Evening Herald would tell their readers that containerisation has played a major part in sounding the death knell of the Dublin docker, reduced from 1,300 in 1971 to their present level of 520. More startling still, that number comes from a front page story on the axing of another 270. And while the Docklands once had the feeling of a city on the edge of a city, with its own traditions, folklore, and identity, all of that was changing in a big, big way. These days, the Dublin Dockworkers Preservation Society, they do a lot of good work trying to capture the memory of those earlier proud and proletarian times. And the best way to understand any kind of pub, of course, is to go to it. Stepping out of your house at 6:30 in the morning to go boozing, even for the purpose of research, feels incredibly seditious. With military precision, I devised a plan to visit the last of the Dublin early houses a few months ago. You're passing bin men and near empty buses. It's too early for the rush hour. The journey is an interesting one. It's great to see Dublin at that time of the day. The logical way, I think, to approach it is to begin on the south side and to make your way towards Cable Street. In the age of the online influencer, going viral, entails a sensationalist headline, designed to pull in the public. You see this all the time on YouTube. It's all in the headline. So when a British YouTuber who prides himself on visiting dingy pubs, most of them on estates, posted a video entitled Dublin's Dodgiest Pub Crawl, just a few days before I embarked on my own research, I had to watch it. I didn't want to watch it. I had to watch it. And totally predictably, nothing dodgy occurred in the video. Instead, he visited a series of largely working class inner city pubs in which he had friendly conversations with barmen and people and drank pints of stout. But I suppose a title saying I had a great time drinking in Dublin's inner city wouldn't get as many clicks. And I wondered if the pubs involved felt a little bit cheated, and if a man with a notepad at 7 o'clock in the morning outside your establishment is a welcome sight after such a betrayal. The logical place to begin this journey is to Pádraig Pearse, named in honour of a signatory of the 1916 proclamation, of course, raised on Pearse Street, as was his brother, William. Patrick Henry Pearse, or Pádraig MacPearse, he never settled on the halfway house of a hybrid name, it was one or the other, was, believe it or not, strictly teetotal. But he's not entirely unique in Dublin as a teetotaler with a public house named after him. You can even have a burger at the Bernard Shaw, and he was vegetarian as well. The pub is emblazoned, of course, with the image of Patrick Pearse, that now iconic side profile, along with the years 1916 to 2016, marking the 100th anniversary of the Rising. It's a friendly pub, it's not a very busy pub, and my eyes were drawn towards a number of things, one of which, quite interestingly, was the price list, the menu, from the Widow Scallon's, a pub which sat on the other side of Pearse Street and which was the target of an Ulster Volunteer Force attack in May 1994. The loyalist history blog Balaclava Street says that only the detonator exploded. Had the bomb worked properly, it is almost certain that most of those in the upstairs lounge would have been killed. Now, those days are thankfully in the past. But pubs, we often think about pubs as that third space removed from work and home life, were frequently targeted over the course of the 3-decade conflict. And it is interesting how the memory of one establishment can linger on in another. A short walk from the Pádraig Pearse, the Windjammer, on the corner of Townsend Street and Lombard Street, is a little busier. Punters deep in discussion about the day's racing. And the journey from one premises to the other brings you past the 1930s modernist public housing schemes of Herbert Simms, schemes that are named in honour of Patrick Pearse and Constance Markovich. And I'm reminded that while the pub near Pearse House is the Pádraig Pearse, the Countess on Townsend Street has been a slowly decaying ruin for many, many years. There are lots of factors in the decline of pubs in this area, not just what I mentioned in terms of the dockers, also the movement of people outwards. There's a plaque on the Corporation Flats in Fenian Street, erected to the memory of 2 young girls killed in a tenement collapse in 1963. The plaque says that within a decade, the population of Westland Row Parish had fallen from 20,000 people to less than 6,000. Containerisation was one dramatic change in the lives of people here, but suburbanisation was another. The Windjammer has quite a unique origin story for a Dublin pub, having been financed and constructed for the Beamish and Crawford Brewery in the 1940s. A windjammer, and look, a 21st century Dubliner would be forgiven for not knowing this, a windjammer was a name bestowed upon 19th century commercial sailing ships with several masts, and the name naturally nods to the near dockside location of the pub. In a time when breweries also dabbled in the public house trade, and Beamish had more than one in Dublin, pubs would be synonymous with particular brands, a system that's still relatively common actually in other places. In London, Samuel Smith's pubs still serve Samuel Smith's beers. But for the Cork Brewery, Ireland's greatest stout, pubs like the Windjammer were important advertising in the capital, where the influence of Guinness was everywhere felt. Crossing over the River Liffey, I take the Talbot Memorial Bridge, and when you do that, it allows the stroller, walking by people going to work, to pass 2 memorials. Firstly, a life-size bronze statue of a Dublin docker at work, Tony McManus's statue. I love that statue. A linesman. He looks just like the kind of hard-working man you'd encounter in one of these institutions 40 years ago at 7 o'clock in the morning. Dating from 1999 and the height of the Celtic Tiger era, it was unveiled at a time when this area was again changing drastically, more associated with the letters IFSC than ITGWU or anything else a docker might have worn on their union badge. But I love that little statue when you see it, and describing the artwork, Donny said the work celebrates the working men of the Dublin docks, on the backs of whom the city was built. Further along, you pass the memorial to Matt Talbot, a working-class Dublin labourer who spurned alcohol, having battled addiction, becoming a real symbol of faith and temperance.
During his long years with the firm of T&C Martins, Matt had to do many different kinds of work. In his early days there, he worked at loading and unloading from ships and drays and handcarts. He disliked working in the docks, not because the work was hard, but because he was offended by some of the language among the men working there.
When Talbot died on his way to Mass on the streets in June 1925, it was discovered that his body was wrapped in chains, a symbol of his religious devotion. And Father Ted, of course, he became Matty Hislop, a notorious drunkard who found God and then decided to punish himself for his sins. But to the workers of Dublin, Matt Talbot was the nearest thing they had to a saint. And in some ways, the placement of his statue says a lot. Though he was a North Sider, he now stands on the south side of the river by the bridge. And when unveiled in the late 80s, the speaker said he would have been out of place over there by the Financial Services Centre. He's more at home here in the Southside docks where he worked. I passed by Connolly Station without stopping. Now, their bar is no longer an early house anyway, but some would have considered it an early house of sorts. Separating train station pubs from the others, you needed an out-of-city train ticket. Seasoned garglers knew what satellite towns were the cheapest admission into that club. On Good Friday, in a time when pubs were still required to close their doors, the special dispensation that was accorded to the train station bar meant that a remarkable number of empty seats were to be found on otherwise fully booked train trips out of the city of Dublin. Only Malloy's on Talbot Street is a true early house on the north side, with Slattery's on Capel Street opening its doors at 9, and I love Slattery's, by the way. Anthony Bourdain, a great admirer of its full Irish breakfast, and the Boar's Head turning the key later again at 10 a.m, still a full 30 minutes before regular business commences elsewhere. But Malloy's, right alongside the railway bridge that crosses over Talbot Street, opens its doors at 7. It's a beautiful building, absolutely fantastic Victorian facade, decorative cast iron features, carved faces adorning the front of the pub, historic advertising mirrors for distilleries that no longer exist, magnificent snugs. As far as Victorian interiors and exteriors go, I think Malloy's is one of the most interesting and overlooked pubs in Dublin. On the morning I drop in, there's a couple of people there who are clearly planning their journey onwards from Connolly Station. An American couple speak loudly, maybe too loudly, over 2 soft drinks of their journey to Belfast and Derry, Londonderry. It's too early in the morning to interject. Akin to stepping out of a cinema at lunchtime, the light does certainly hit you a bit differently when you emerge a little bit tipsy from a morning excursion into these places. And one barman would tell a journalist once that if we want to move people along who've had a bit much, we pull up the blinds. They react like vampires at the purging shaft of light coming in through the window. You do feel a little bit more Nosferatu than Miles Nagopolian ending a journey like that. Getting the bus home as others are settling into the beginnings of a working day. Clearly, these institutions are part of a dying breed, and the picture is the same everywhere. Despite vast differences in scale, the number of early houses in London does not actually exceed the number here. And while the Fox and Anchor by Smithfield Market opens its doors at 7 o'clock in the morning, London pubs now generally prefer to open later and close earlier than their Dublin equivalent in almost all cases. It seems to be, everywhere, last orders at the early house.